My name is Jack Mason. My home is in a small town in Pennsylvania, and this story happened a few years ago. I have always believed that I live in a safe and peaceful place where everyone knows their neighbor and the door is always unlocked. One fall, I was returning home late at night after a shift at the local hospital where I worked as a nurse. It was already about 11 o'clock, and the only road leading to my house was through a dense forest. I felt tired while driving, and all I could think about was how to get home as quickly as possible and fall into bed. That night, the road seemed endless to me. The beams of the headlights pulled out of the darkness the trees, which swept the sky with their branches, creating strange shadows. I drove slower than usual because I felt some unexplained anxiety. And then I saw him. A man was standing on the roadside. He looked like a lost tourist or just an odd traveler. His face was hidden by his hood, and he stood there, motionless, looking straight at me. It was strange, but I decided not to stop. Who knows what's on his mind, I thought. But the next day, when I told my colleagues about it, they just laughed at me, saying that I was just scared because I was tired. Maybe they were right, but this meeting did not leave my thoughts. It was just the beginning. Over the next few days, I began to notice him more often. First near the forest, then near my house. Each time he just stood there and watched, and every time I got goosebumps. A few days after my first meeting with a stranger, I woke up in the middle of the night. It was 3 o'clock in the morning, and all around was as quiet as a grave. However, I felt that something was wrong. The heart began to pound, and a cold sweat appeared on the forehead. I got up from the bed and went to the window. Staring into the darkness, I could see nothing, but the feeling that someone was looking at me never left. I decided to go back to bed, but as I took a step back, I heard a light knock on the window. It was so quiet I wasn't sure if it actually happened. Coming closer, I tried to see at least something in the darkness, and then I saw him again. The same hooded man was standing by my window looking straight at me. His face was still hidden, but I could feel his eyes drilling into me. I froze in place, not knowing what to do. Is he just joking, or does he have evil intentions? I tried to collect my thoughts, but suddenly the man disappeared. It happened so fast that I didn't even have time to move. The next day, I decided I needed to talk to the local police. The town is small, so I knew the Jackson's officer. James Jackson was one of the few officers in our area. I went to the station and told him about the stranger. James listened carefully, but didn't seem too concerned. He said it might just be a local vagrant or a prankster who decided to scare people, but I wasn't sure it was just a coincidence. James promised to patrol the area more often to reassure me. I returned home, but the feeling of anxiety did not go away. At night, I could not sleep again, waiting for the hooded man to return. I didn't see a stranger for the next few days, and that calmed me down a bit. Maybe he really was just a tramp who decided to move on. But disturbing thoughts did not leave my head. I began to wonder if there had been similar cases in our town before. One day, I decided to visit the local archives in the library. Mrs. Clarkson, the librarian, knew all the town gossip and was always happy to help. I explained to her that I was looking for information about any strange happenings in our town. She looked at me curiously, but didn't ask too many questions. She took me to the old newspaper archives and left me to look through the yellowed pages. I started with issues from 5 years ago, looking for something that could explain my fears. And so I came across an article that sent chills down my spine. The headline read, "3 Young Girls Missing in Montgomery." The article talked about how 3 girls disappeared in our town over the past few years. The last disappearance was a year ago, and none of them have been found. This was disturbing information. I kept the article to myself, deciding that I should learn more about these cases. The next day, I decided to visit the parents of one of the missing girls. They lived on the other side of town, and I knew it would be a difficult conversation, but I had to try. When I approached their house, a middle-aged woman with sad eyes opened the door. It was Mrs. Williams, mother of the missing Rachel. I explained to her who I was and that I wanted to know more about her daughter's disappearance. She invited me into the living room and began to tell me. Mrs. Williams said that on the last evening before she disappeared, Rachel returned home from a night out with friends and said she saw a strange man following her. She didn't think much of it, but she disappeared the next day. This story confirmed my worst fears. The stranger I saw could be involved in the disappearances. I thanked Mrs. Williams and returned home with a heavy heart. knowing I had to find a way to find out more. The next morning, waking with a heavy heart after my conversation with Mrs. Williams, I decided I must act quickly. I went to Officer James Jackson again. He met me with the same calm eyes, but this time they flashed with interest as I told him about the article I had found and the conversation I had had with Mrs. Williams. "Jack, this is very serious," he said after I had finished my story. "I'll call the detective who handled these disappearances. He might want to talk to you." Detective John Garrett arrived a few hours later. Tall, with gray hair and piercing eyes, he immediately inspired trust. I told him in detail about all my observations and meetings with the stranger. "This could be an important clue," he said, jotting everything down in his notebook. "We'll have to check it out. Can you accurately describe the man?" I tried to remember every detail: the dark hood, the gaunt face, the pale skin. The detective thanked me and promised to leave police reinforcements for my area for the next few nights. I went to bed that night feeling a little more secure. I felt I had done everything I could to stop this man. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over yet. Suddenly, in the middle of the night, I woke up to a loud knock on the door. The heart jumped in the chest. Who could it be? I went to the door and cautiously looked through the window. Officer James Jackson stood in the doorway. "Jack, open it! It's important!" I heard his voice. I opened the door and James came in looking excited. "What happened?" I asked. "Detective Garrett found something. We need you to come with us to the station. We found a car that may be connected to your stranger," he said. I quickly got dressed and went with James to the station. Detective Garrett met us there. He showed me pictures of an old rusty van that he had found in the woods nearby. Inside were the personal belongings of the missing girls. "That's our biggest clue," Garrett said. "We found the fingerprints and sent them off for examination. We may soon learn more about this man." I returned home trying to calm down, but there was still fear inside me. Who was this man? Why was he following me? And what should I do if he appears again? The next day, I couldn't concentrate at work. My thoughts kept returning to the found van and the missing girls. My colleagues noticed my anxiety, but I didn't want to talk to anyone about what was happening. They would just think I was paranoid. In the evening, returning home, I constantly looked around as if waiting to see a stranger around every corner. However, the road was empty. As I drove up to my house, I had a strange feeling. Something was wrong. I stopped the car and got out, carefully looking around. It was quiet in the yard, only the rustling of leaves on the trees. I went to the door and, putting the key in the lock, heard a strange noise from inside. Stopping, I held my breath and listened. The noise repeated itself. It felt like someone or something was in my house. I opened the door slowly, trying not to make too much noise. The living room was dark. I fumbled for the switch and turned on the light. Nothing. I took a few steps forward and suddenly I heard someone's voice. "Don't move, Jack." My heart jumped in my chest. I turned and saw a stranger. He was standing in the corner of the room holding a knife in his hand. His face was only dimly lit, but I recognized the same eyes that were staring at me through the window. "Who are you? What do you want?" I asked, trying not to show my fear. "My name is Mark, and I'm here to warn you. You've learned too much, Jack. Now you're one of us." I didn't understand what he was talking about, but his words sounded like a sentence. He took a step forward and I felt a cold sweat run down my back. "Why are you doing this? Why were you following me?" I tried to find out. Mark smiled, and his smile was terrifying. "You think you can stop me? You're just a small grain of sand in this world. But now you know too much, and I can't let you stay alive." At that point, I knew I had to act fast. Without thinking, I rushed to the kitchen where my cell phone was lying. I knew I had to call James or Garrett before it was too late. However, Mark was faster. He lunged after me, and I felt the knife go past me, almost catching my arm. I grabbed my phone and hit speed dial, calling the police. "Help! There's a stranger with a knife in my house!" I shouted when I heard a beep from the other end of the line. Mark tried to attack me again, but I backed into a corner, trying to keep him at bay. I heard the police operator answer and hoped that reinforcements were on their way. Mark stopped and looked at me with hatred. "It's not over yet, Jack. You will see me again," he said, and suddenly rushed to the window. He broke it and jumped out, disappearing into the darkness of the night. The police arrived a few minutes later. They searched the house, but Mark was gone. James Jackson and Detective Garrett were impressed with my story. They promised to do everything possible to find him, but I knew it wasn't the end. Now I was drawn into a game from which it was not so easy to get out. The next few days were spent in fear and anticipation. The police promised to patrol my neighborhood more often, but I still felt unsafe. Every sound in the night made me jump, and every rustle made me check the windows and doors. Detective Garrett left me his number and told me to call him anytime if I saw anything suspicious. But Mark disappeared, as if dissolved in thin air. The police couldn't find any leads, and I began to think he might have left town. One evening, I was sitting in the living room trying to concentrate on reading when I heard the doorbell ring. I was worried, but I decided to check who it was. I looked through the window and saw a strange man in a suit. Opening the door, I saw that it was Detective Garrett. His expression was serious, and he invited me to sit down. "Jack, we have news," he began. "We found fingerprints in the van, and they belong to Mark Sloan. He was in the database because of previous arrests for petty offenses, but nothing that would point to a serial killer." "What does it mean?" I asked, trying to understand. "That means Mark was careful to cover his tracks. We found a few clues in the van that might help us figure out where he is now, but that's still not enough," Garrett replied. "Is there anything I can do?" I asked, feeling helpless. "Keep in touch, Jack. If you see or hear anything suspicious, call me right away and be careful," he said and left. That night I could not sleep. I felt that Mark was still around and that his return was only a matter of time. I decided to be alert and always have my phone handy. In the morning, when I was leaving the house to go to work, I noticed something strange about my car. A piece of paper was attached to the windshield. I carefully removed it and unfolded it. It was a letter from Mark. "Jack, I warned you. Now you can't hide. I'll find you wherever you are, and next time you won't be so lucky." My hands shook. I felt the fear come over me again. I immediately called Detective Garrett and told him about the letter. He said he would be right back and advised not to touch anything else. When Garrett arrived, he carefully examined the letter in the car, looking for any clues that might point to Mark. There were no prints, and Garrett was annoyed. "That means he was here very recently. We have to find him before he does anything else," he said. The police started patrolling my neighborhood again, but I knew Mark was cunning. He played his game and knew how to stay inconspicuous. I returned home feeling trapped. Mark was somewhere nearby, and I didn't know when he would strike again, but I was ready. I decided I wasn't going to let him break me that easily. Days passed, and my life turned into a constant wait. I started equipping my house with defenses, installed additional locks on doors and windows, bought surveillance cameras to see everything that happens around my house. I could no longer trust even my neighbors. Fear became my constant companion. One evening, when I got home from work, I found another letter on my doorstep. This time it was in a plain envelope with no return address. Unfolding it, I saw a short message. "Jack, you will not escape your fate. We will meet again, and this time I will see it through." My hands shook. I felt my heart pounding in my chest. But this time I wasn't scared. I was furious. I called Detective Garrett and told him about the letter. He promised to come immediately. When Garrett arrived, he carefully examined the letter and the envelope. Again, he found no fingerprints or other traces. Mark was too cautious. "That means he's watching you," Garrett said. "Perhaps he lives nearby. We must be prepared for any developments." I decided I couldn't sit idly by anymore. I must act. I started asking the neighbors if they had seen anything suspicious. Most of them knew nothing, but one neighbor, Mrs. Pierce, said she had seen a strange man walking near my house several times. He seemed suspicious to her, but she did not attach much importance to it. This was the first concrete trace. I told Garrett about this, and he decided to set up an ambush. Several undercover officers began patrolling my neighborhood at night, hoping to find Mark. The next evening, when I was about to go to bed, I heard a strange sound from outside. My heart pounded in my chest, and I slowly approached the window. Opening it, I saw the silhouette of a man standing next to my car. It was Mark. I immediately grabbed my phone and called Detective Garrett, trying not to give away my presence. "Garrett, Hez here, by my car," I whispered. Garrett ordered me to stay put and wait for reinforcements. I tried to stay calm, but fear and anger overwhelmed me. A few minutes later, I heard sirens and the police arrived. Mark tried to run, but the officers were faster. They grabbed him and handcuffed him. As he was led to the police car, he turned to me and smiled. "It's not over yet, Jack," he said ominously. "I'll be back." The police took him away, and I could finally breathe a sigh of relief. But deep down, I knew his words could be true. Now I was involved in something much bigger and scarier than mere stalking. After the arrest of Mark, I hoped that everything would finally be over, but the anxiety did not leave me. I knew that until he was convicted, the danger still existed. The police had him in custody, and Detective Garrett assured me that Mark would not be released anytime soon. The next day, I went to the station to testify. Garrett met me and took me to the interrogation room. There, behind the glass wall, sat Mark. His face was calm, even satisfied. "Jack, we need to talk to you about what happened," Garrett began. "Mark claims he's known you longer than you think. He says you used to know each other." I was surprised. "What? I've never seen him before. He's just some psycho." "We're checking everything he says, but there's one thing that has us confused," Garrett continued. "Mark mentioned an incident that happened years ago when you were still a teenager. Do you remember anything like that?" I tried hard to remember. Nothing concrete came to mind. "No, I don't remember any incidents involving Mark. I don't even know who he is." Garrett nodded and asked me to be in touch if I remembered anything important. I left the station feeling even more confused. Why did Mark claim we knew each other? What did he mean? I couldn't sleep that night thinking about everything that had happened. Suddenly I remembered how one day when I was about 16, I was walking in the park with my friends. There was a guy there a few years older than us named Mark. He was weird, always aloof and talking about strange things. But it couldn't be the same Mark, could it? The next morning I went back to the station and told Garrett about my memory. He decided to check this information and find out if this Mark was the same guy. A few days later, Garrett called me. "Jack, we've done some investigating. That Mark you remember might actually be our suspect. He lived in your neighborhood and was involved in a few strange incidents. Maybe he's been harboring a grudge all these years." This news stunned me. How could a guy I barely knew turn into a serial killer and start stalking me after so many years? I tried to understand his motivation, but I couldn't find a logical explanation. The next few weeks were difficult. Mark was held in custody, but the court hearing has not yet begun. I tried to live my life, but every day was filled with fear and anxiety. One evening, when I was coming home from work, I noticed that the door to my apartment was open. I froze in place, feeling a cold sweat run down my back. Gathering all my courage, I went inside. The apartment was quiet, but everything looked different. Furniture was moved, things were scattered. It looked like a search, but nothing was taken. I called Garrett and told him about it. He arrived a few minutes later with a group of forensics. They examined the apartment, but did not find any traces that could point to the intruder. It was very strange and scared me even more. "Jack, we're going to keep you under surveillance. It could be Mark or someone else playing their game," Garrett said. I was left alone with my thoughts. The unknown scared me even more. Who could have broken into my house, and what were they looking for? And most importantly, when will it all finally end? The next few days were terrible. I could feel Mark getting closer to me with each step, even though he was being held in custody. Every phone call, every unfamiliar look caused me fear and suspicion. The police continued to investigate, but without concrete evidence, they could not keep Mark behind bars forever. One evening, as I was getting ready for bed, my phone rang. It was Garrett. "Jack, we have some bad news," he began. "Mark escaped from custody. We don't know how it happened, but he disappeared." My heart pounded in my chest. How was that possible? How did he manage to escape? I felt the fear come over me again. Garrett continued to speak, but I could barely hear what he was saying. I knew that now I was in even greater danger. "We are doing everything we can to find him. Keep your phone handy and don't leave the house. We're sending a patrol to your area," Garrett said, and I heard him hang up. I locked all the doors and windows, checked the surveillance cameras, and tried to calm down, but it was in vain. Every noise sounded suspicious, and I couldn't shake the feeling that Mark was somewhere nearby. That night I could not sleep. All my thoughts were focused on the fact that Mark is here somewhere, and he will come for me again. In the end, I only dozed off for a few hours, constantly waking up at the slightest sound. In the morning, I decided to act. I couldn't just sit around and wait for Mark to show up again. I went to the place where my teenage friends and I used to hang out, the park where I met Mark for the first time. Maybe I'll find a clue there, something that will help me understand why he's after me. The park was empty. I walked the paths, trying to remember everything that had happened so many years ago. And suddenly I saw the old bench where we used to sit. When I got closer, I saw that the initials were carved on it, JW and MS. It was my initials and Mark's initials. It was strange and frightening. Why did he carve our initials on the bench? I felt that this bench had some special meaning for him. Perhaps this was where it all began. Suddenly, I heard a rustle behind me. I looked back and saw Mark. He stood in the shade of the trees watching me. "Jack," he said quietly, "do you remember this place?" My heart beat faster. "What do you want from me, Mark? Why are you chasing me?" Mark smiled, but his smile was cold and ruthless. "You forgot, but I remember. You were my friend, and then you betrayed me." "I don't understand," I answered, trying to remember. "What have I done?" "You left me when I needed it the most," Mark said, his voice filled with anger. "You were the only one who could help, but you just left. Now I'm back to pay you back." I felt a cold sweat run down my back. "Mark, I don't remember that. If I really did something wrong, I apologize. But that doesn't excuse your actions." Mark took a step forward, his eyes blazing with hatred. "You're not running away anymore, Jack. It's over here and now." I felt my body tense up, preparing for a possible attack, but suddenly I heard police sirens. It was Garrett and his team. They arrived on time. Mark tried to escape, but the officers quickly surrounded him and captured him. He was screaming and struggling, but they managed to detain him and put him in a police car. Garrett walked up to me. "Are you all right, Jack? Aren't you hurt?" I nodded, still in disbelief that it was over. "Yeah, it's fine. Thanks for coming. Mark will be under strict surveillance until the trial. We will not allow him to escape again," Garrett assured me. I returned home feeling that a great burden had been lifted from my shoulders, but deep down I knew this nightmare would stay with me forever. I experienced something that I will never forget, and it made me appreciate every day of my life. After Mark's rearrest, I slowly started to get back to normal, but the memories of everything that happened did not give me peace. I felt like every day was a challenge, but I was determined not to let fear rule me anymore. Mark's trial was approaching, and Detective Garrett asked me to testify. It wasn't an easy decision, but I knew I had to help so Mark could never hurt me or anyone else again. On the day of the trial, I sat in the courtroom awaiting my summons. When I was invited to the podium, I felt my heart begin to beat faster. All eyes were on me, but I tried to remain calm. The lawyer asked me about all the events surrounding Mark, and I told my story. When I finished, the judge thanked me for my testimony, and I returned to my seat with relief. Mark was sitting in the hall looking at me with the same cold and ruthless expression on his face. I could feel his gaze even after I returned to my seat. His presence was frightening, but I knew he couldn't hurt me now. The trial lasted several weeks. All testimony and evidence were carefully studied. In the end, Mark was found guilty of all crimes and sentenced to life in prison without parole. This decision brought me relief. I knew I was safe now, and Mark would never be able to hurt me again. But deep down, I knew that this experience would forever leave its mark on my life. After the trial, I decided to move to another city where no one knew me. I found a new job, new friends, and started building my life anew. But the memory of what happened never left me. Every time I felt myself overcome with fear, I reminded myself that I had survived the worst and emerged victorious. I learned to appreciate each day and enjoy the simple things in life. Over time, the wounds began to heal. I found peace in a new city and learned to trust people again. But I always remembered the lesson that this experience taught me. Life can be cruel and unpredictable, but we have the strength to fight and win. A few years passed, and I began to live without constant fear. But sometimes, when the night covers the city and the wind rustles outside the window, I remember those terrible days and feel a chill constrict in my chest. But I'm not afraid anymore. I learned to live with this fear and turned it into my strength. And now, as I look to the future, I know I can handle any challenge that comes my way. A new beginning in a new city brought me a long-awaited sense of peace. I found a job in a small office where I worked in marketing. My colleagues were friendly and helped me get used to my new place quickly. A few months later, when my life started to settle down, I met Sarah. She worked at a cafe near my office, and we started talking during our lunch breaks. Sarah was an interesting and intelligent woman, and over time, our conversations grew into something more. We started dating, and our relationship developed rapidly. Sarah helped me forget about those terrible events and feel the joy of life again. She was the first person to whom I confided and told my story. Sarah listened to me carefully and supported me in everything. She understood my fear and anxiety and never judged me. Thanks to her, I felt that I could be happy again. One evening, while we were walking in the park, Sarah stopped and took my hand. "Jack, I know you've been through a lot, and I'm proud of the way you're handling it," she said. "I want to be with you and support you in everything, no matter what happens." I felt warmth spread through my body. Her words meant more to me than she could have imagined. I hugged her and promised myself that I would never let the past ruin our future. Our relationship with Sarah became a new meaning of life for me. We started planning our future together, and I felt like I had finally found my place in this world. But one day, when we returned home after a walk, I found a letter on my doorstep. It was similar to the ones I used to get when Mark was chasing me. My heart sank, and I felt the old fear come over me again. Tearing open the envelope, I read the message. "Jack, did you think it was over? No, this is just the beginning. It'll always be there for you." I showed Sarah the letter, and she turned pale. "It could be someone who just knows your story and wants to scare you," she said, trying to calm me down. "We should report this to the police." We immediately called Garrett and told him about the letter. He promised to investigate and find whoever did it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that everything was starting again. The following days were tense. I was constantly looking around and checking every corner of my house. Sarah supported me, but I could see that she was also afraid. Garrett called a few days later. "Jack, we've checked all possible options, but we haven't found anything concrete yet. But we'll continue to investigate. Don't lose hope." These words were a small consolation for me. I knew that Mark was still in prison, but the fear that someone else might continue his case kept me at bay. One evening, when I got home, I found another letter. This time it was shorter. "Jack, I know where you live. See you soon." My patience has run out. I decided to take matters into my own hands. I installed additional surveillance cameras around my house and began to monitor every movement in the area. I knew I couldn't let fear ruin my new life. A few days later, I noticed something strange on one of the cameras. An unknown man was standing near my house and was staring intently through the window. He looked familiar, but I couldn't remember where I'd seen him before. I called Garrett and told him about my find. He promised to come and check the recording. When he arrived, we watched the video together. Garrett recognized the man immediately. This is one of Mark's former acquaintances. He was involved in several crimes, but always managed to avoid punishment. We decided to organize an ambush. Garrett placed several undercover officers in my area in hopes of finding this man. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the dark watching the monitors. Around midnight, I saw the same man reappear near my house. He looked around as if looking for something. Suddenly, officers appeared out of the darkness and grabbed him. He tried to run away, but the police quickly surrounded him and detained him. As the man was led to the police car, he looked at me with hatred in his eyes. "It's not over, Jack. We'll be back." I felt a cold sweat run down my back, but this time I wasn't scared. I was determined to protect my life and my loved ones. Garrett walked up to me. "We'll keep him in custody and try to find out more about his plans. You did the right thing, Jack. Now we know that Mark is not alone." I nodded, feeling like this nightmare wasn't over yet. But now I was ready for any challenge. I knew I could protect myself and my loved ones, and that I was not alone in this struggle. After the arrest of the man who was watching my house, I began to feel a little more at ease. The police assured me that he will not be released until they find out all the circumstances of his connection with Mark. However, I knew that this was not the end. My enemies were organized and determined. The next few weeks were relatively quiet. I tried not to think about the possible dangers and spent more time with Sarah. We enjoyed the simple things, walks in the park, evenings at home with movies and talking about our future. These moments helped me distract myself